Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We're really excited to present this new training that we have just come out with within the last couple of months, management and finance. We're super excited to present this information to you because we know it's a need for a lot of our workforce. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Tricia Miller. She is going to give us so much great information today, and I cannot wait for her to get started. So, Tricia, welcome and good morning.
If I could unmute myself, that would be a start, right? Good morning, everyone. So thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you will find this training useful and things that you can at least, it's a lot of information, I will say that. So when we do a training in this short amount of time, I do my best to give you absolutely everything we can. And hopefully that you can then go back and kind of look through and let some of that stuff seep in, looking at your own budgets and your own grants. Hopefully it will give you just some starting points to where to look at. And also, there's several handouts that you'll get to take with you so you can kind of look back through the information after we finish. So hopefully that is also useful and helpful because that's what we want to do. We don't want to waste anybody's time with stuff that we can't look back at. And again, I realize it's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but that way we can just give a really broad overview of some of the things that you might be looking for, especially even if you have been doing this for a while. It's good to sort of evaluate like where you're at and how you look at things. I know for many of you, you have gone into this, you may have been given a grant or you're getting in charge of a grant or in charge of a program, and maybe you don't have a whole lot of background in budgeting and finance, and it can be really overwhelming. And again, even if you've been doing it forever, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've been doing it in a way that is effective and efficient just because you were kind of stuck with it. So hopefully that this will give you a time to kind of step back and look at your grants, look at your budgets, especially if you're getting ready to reapply for a grant. It's a good time for you to take a look at the budget narrative, look at what you've been doing in the past, and sort of get back on track if you need to make some adjustments. So that's kind of what we're going to cover for today. So I'm going to go ahead here and share screen, I hope. Okay. Are we there? We're sharing screen. Okay. I'm going to
Yes,
assume that.
yeah,
Okay.
you're on.
Thank you. Okay. Perfect. All right. So there we go. So here's just some of the things that we're going to kind of cover for today. We're going to identify the three overarching categories of resources that managers allocate. We're going to distinguish the difference between in-kind contributions, direct costs, and indirect costs. So there's the part where I try to make you not fall asleep on me. Then we're going to compare the grant budget versus the project program budget, or what we call the total budget. And then we're going to work on calculating a simple variance analysis. This is just a really quick, easy tool. Some of you may be using it already. Perhaps this will be new information for you. And again, it's a very simple calculation, but it's a really good way to kind of gauge where you're at in terms of keeping on track with your budget and your expenses, and what does that look like broken down over the year, and do we need to make some changes about how we look at that. And then we're going to talk about various alternatives to dealing with budget cuts, because unfortunately, budget cuts is always the thing in the back of everybody's minds. We hear it all the time. Oh, our funding, our funding, our funding. And so how do we deal with that? And what are some different alternatives for doing that? And then I'll provide, basically, we're going to do a in-class exercise, but we won't really do anything. I'm going to kind of give it to you so you can take it back and maybe play around with it yourself. And then maybe you can apply that to your own budget. So that's the hope with that. And then we're also going to talk about the importance of documentation. This is one of those most often overlooked things for not only management, but for budgeting and for finance, and trying to keep track and make sure you're checking in with the right people, and why are you documenting, and how important that actually is overall. And I know the higher ups have told me, you know, when I've been able to work with subject matter experts, both in the management and in, you know, when I'm talking to, let's say the CFO for the state health department, documentation is one of those things that they always say, make sure you talk about this, make sure you talk about this. So hopefully that will be good as well. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the budget narrative, and we're going to focus on the importance of why it is that you be as precise as possible in that budget narrative, because that's going to be what you're held to as far as your responsibility as managing the grant. So like I said, again, for those of you who either already have a grant, it might be time to pull out that budget narrative and make sure you're staying within the parameters of what was in there if you were not the one to get the grant, to apply for the grant. And then also if you are getting ready to reapply for a grant at some time, that this should give you some pointers, hopefully, to kind of look at. So that's what we're going to cover today. Seems like an awful lot in an hour and a half, which it is. So, well, let's get on this roller coaster ride. Okay, so the first thing is, what do managers do, right? So first, let me just talk a little bit about the terminology of management. Management actually means to allocate resources to accomplish things. Seems pretty easy, right? But I don't think we think about management sort of in terms of that you're allocating resources to accomplish things. So you're actually managing the resources that you have. And management is not the same as leadership, okay? So a leader is somebody who provides vision and direction for where you want to go, okay? A manager sees that tasks are performed on time and done correctly, okay? So a good example is kind of like in the political world, we talk about the difference between Jimmy Carter and a Ronald Reagan. So Jimmy Carter was a manager, like he wanted to put things down and make sure things were running and talk about how we can make changes and be more efficient and be effective. And Ronald Reagan was like the shining city on the hill, big picture, big vision, big kind of thing. And we could probably look at the same thing, you know, in presidents even past that, and it's maybe even some of your leaders, and you can think about that within your own organization. Now, as I talk about the difference between management and leadership, the reality is most of you are probably doing both, right? If you are managing a grant, if you are running a program, even if you're working within a program, you're probably putting on multiple hats, and you're probably doing some leadership and some management, or both. So really we're focusing on today, okay, if we're not looking at that big broad vision per se, what are we doing to actually do the management part of it? So how are we allocating resources to accomplish things, okay? So we just want to talk about that allocation. Okay, so what does this mean? So what are the roles and responsibilities? Well, there's really three main ones. So managers allocate resources, which was just in that definition that we have. Managers obviously need skills to do that. And you also have to be giving some responsibility and authority, or you really can't manage, right? So that's kind of how we're looking at things. And we're really going to focus today on how managers allocate resources and what do we look at as far as costs, and how do we put that into our budget, and how are we managing our budget and our people, and what are we doing of those things. So first of all, let's talk about managers allocating resources. So there are three of them, three things that managers do three things that we just said, but in this managers allocating resources, there are three things: time, money, and things, okay? So in your handouts folder that you can look at later, it actually talks about each one of these and breaking down the time, money, and things, and particularly the things, because obviously that's a pretty generic word. So I'm not going to pull it up here, but it's actually called resource allocation in your handout. And so it would be really good for you later to open that sheet and think about which of these things are you currently allocating? Are you missing any that are on the list? Like, should you be focusing on something that's on this list that maybe you hadn't really thought about as one of those things that you should be managing? And the other thing is, which one of those consumes your most time? And should they be, right? Are you actually managing your own time in a way, your own resources in a way that it's efficient and effective for what you need to get done? So that handout is just, and again, they're just basic things on there, but I think it's really good for us to sort of take an inventory of where we're spending our time. What does our day look like? And where could we maybe cut some time to spend on maybe some other things that we haven't really focused on that would help our organization and or our program, you know, to run more smoothly. So again, that handout is called resource allocation. Okay, so once you've done that, you've kind of looked at, okay, here's what I'm doing. I'm allocating resources and managing time, money, and things. You've looked at that resource allocation and you've said, okay, here's where I really focus. I probably should focus a little more on that. I haven't really done that. And perhaps one of those areas is kind of like the budgeting and the money, right? This is like everybody's least favorite thing. I know the majority of you probably did not go into public health to be worrying about in-kind contributions and direct costs and indirect costs, and you're thinking, I got through an econ class in undergrad and I thought that was it. And now here we are. So let's just kind of break this down a little bit and see what we can think about as far as the budget components themselves, okay? So here's what we're gonna cover in this section. We're gonna cover the 5 components of a total project budget versus the actual grant budget. We're going to talk about what are exactly in-kind contributions, what counts as that, how do we allocate that, when do we have to be careful not to get in trouble with those. We're going to discuss the differences between indirect costs and direct costs. And we're also going to talk a little bit about allowable versus unallowable costs, and I'm going to give you a couple resources to go and check some of those things, basically from documentation from HHS at the federal level, so you can kind of start to learn like what you might be able to count and what you might not be able to count. And then we're going to talk about the budget breakdown, what should be included and under what categories. Okay, so again, a lot of you are already working with budgets. Maybe you've been doing this for a long time. Perhaps you're relatively new at it. So this is where I would suggest, again, going through that budget, looking to see how you have it laid out and where you might be able to make some changes while we're going over this today. So perhaps even if nothing else, you can make some notes about, oh, let me go check this later, and that will be beneficial. So here's one of the links, and again, you'll have this PowerPoint, so you'll have this link to get to. So this is the grant dictionary, very, very useful, especially when you're working on, when we get to talking about the budget narrative at the end of today. This gives a lot of different definitions and things that you have to follow. And so perhaps you're reading something and you think, I don't really know what that means. Well, yes, we could Google that and find a dictionary, but this particular dictionary is very grant specific. So it helps in terms of the terminology that you're going to see potentially in your paperwork for grants. So it's just a very useful tool to just kind of double check where you're at. So I wanted to make sure we had access to that. And then what is the budget, right? And so when we talk about that in terms of class work, right, we talk about differences, and you're going to hear these terms probably: operating, expense, or revenue budget. So, you know, you probably just think, oh, here's my budget. But one of the things that you want to think about is, are you doing an operating budget or an expense budget or a revenue budget or some sort of combination of them? So let's just talk about what the differences are. So if we look, an expense budget is a budget that focuses on the cost of providing goods and services, okay? So if you're looking just at cost, like what does it cost to run your program, that's what's considered the expense budget. On the other hand of that, we have what we call the revenue budget. And this is the part that focuses on revenues of an organization or the subunit, right? And then finally, the operating budget is actually the combination of the two. So this is one budget that includes both the revenue and the expenses. Now, if you have revenue and you're dealing with the overall budget, then that means you're actually using an operating budget, okay? Because if you included both the expenses and the revenue, that's technically operating, okay? But if you don't have revenue, then all you're ever really working with is an expense budget, okay? And so one thing we want to talk about a little bit is the budget trap is what we call it. And so we're going to come back to this a couple of times, but I just want to briefly mention it here. So if your budget is broken down just for the year, that can be problematic because it's really hard for you to keep on track throughout the course of the year to make sure you're staying on budget. And obviously we don't want to get to the end of that 12-month period and find that we are over budget. That is not good. But also sometimes and this happens even in the business world, people break things down into quarters, which can be fine and obviously is much better than doing it at that 12-month mark. But the problem with that is that when you're doing it that way, and some of you I think will recognize this just as I talk through it, think about perhaps that you have busier times of the year, right? Like for instance, if you are maybe in a position where you are offering flu shots, right? You're going to have a lot more income potentially, the revenue from those, but you also may have more costs at that time. And so if you break your budget down only into quarters, let's say you break that down evenly, then the problem becomes what happens when you spend way more in one quarter and then you have to like adjust for that because you're like, oh, well, I'm going to spend less in quarter 4. So realistically, you should be budgeting each one of those quarters separately, not just a straight like, oh, let me break this. Here's my total amount, divide by 4, because that may not work for you. So perhaps you want to take a look at your budget and think, is that how I'm breaking this down in 4 chunks? And are they even? And should they be? Do you need to make adjustments? So let's just use a really quick example. Like, let's say your budget was $100. We'll go with something simple so we don't have to worry about math this morning. And let's say you've broken that down into 4 quarters, so that's $25 per quarter. But what you're finding is in quarter 2, you're actually spending 50 of those dollars. Well, then that means you would have to have no spending in one of the other quarters. Or let's say you were spending $35 instead of 25. You would then have to pull down something in another quarter to bring that back to that $35 mark so you could make it, or that $45 mark, $40 mark, so you could make up the difference. So it's really nice to kind of look at your budget and see how you're actually doing this. And so one of the tools that we're going to talk about in a little bit is the variance analysis. And that can kind of help you compare to like month by month and to see like where you're hitting your budget and where you're not. And then can you readjust like where you're allocating those resources for expenses over the course of the year so that you know by the time you finish that you're going to be on budget and be good to go. Okay. All right. So the next thing we want to talk about is the project budget versus the grant request. Okay. So the first thing we have to deal with is that the project budget is not the same as your grant request. So that's one of the things that I find the most often, that people are like, oh, I have this grant. This is going to cover this project or this program. So a project budget includes all of the costs of implementing the project. The grant request is the amount of money that you're asking the grantor to give you. Okay. So the project budget is always larger than the grant request. And for those of you who have been doing this, you know this. That grant does not cover 100% of everything that you have to do to cover your program. And so then you have to figure that out. And so if you are new to this, that's one of the big things you have to remember. There's no exceptions, none ever. In order for the project budget to be the same as the grant request, then the organization implementing the project and all the other people and potentially organizations that are involved in this project would have to contribute absolutely nothing. Think it this way. If the project budget and the grant request were the same, the following would have to be true. 0 contributions other than the grant are made to running the project. And by 0, I mean like absolutely nothing, which like some of you, perhaps if you're managing multiple programs, you're giving your time to both of those things and they're not coming out of that particular grant, which means your project budget is different than your grant request. Okay. So no persons, no papers, no computers, no contributions at all. And if we think about that, like I said, most of you are probably involved in some things where you're perhaps giving your time as an in-kind contribution, which still would make your project budget different than your grant request. And the reason that that matters is because you're going to keep track of your project budget. Like that's your job as a manager. But when you're asking for the grant request, you're going to be very specific when it comes to that budget narrative to talking about what you're actually asking for. And most of the time when you're making a grant request, they don't actually ask you for the project budget as a whole. What they're asking you is you're asking for a set amount of dollars and how are you going to spend that? And then you have to figure out, okay, if I have this money coming from this grant, where else am I having to cover that makes the project budget as a whole? So those two things are very separate. And sometimes in the grant, they will ask you for the entire project budget because they want to see how much of your project or your program is being funded by the grant that you're asking for. But you really want to make sure that when you're applying for these, that are they just asking you specifically for the grant request? And if so, that's all you need to give them. You don't want to give them your project budget because that gets confusing, because let's say you're asking for $5,000 and your project budget is $7,500, there's a disconnect there. And so that can cause some delays as far as grant processing. So if the papers are asking you for the grant request, you need to be outlining what you're doing with that $5,000, not what you're doing with the whole $7,500. Okay. Okay. So again, it's possible that the grantor will not ask you for the project, but only the accounting of how you're going to spend the money that you are given in the form of that grant. So this is usually called the budget. Sometimes they call it the project budget, which is really confusing because we're actually differentiating the two here. but you're just really accounting for spending the granted money. That, again, most of the time they don't care about what else you have to do to make that work. It's very confusing. And if you're already working with a budget, I'm sure you can attest to the fact that the project budget and the grant request are never the same. Okay, so what's the difference between the two? So for the total project budget, if we're dealing with the whole thing, this is the grant request. It's also whatever your organization is going to contribute. It's also going to be any of the partners' contributions, or if you have any volunteer contributions, and also if you have any revenue that is generated by your project or your program. Okay, so there's actually these 5 things. That's what we're talking about when we talk about your total project or your total program budget. It's all of these things combined, everything that you're bringing in, everything that you're spending. How are you taking this in? How are you working with community partners? On the other hand, the grant request, when awarded, is actually just cash. So your organization's contribution can be cash or in kind or both. And partner contributions can be the same. You can be getting cash from them, or maybe they're sending you volunteers to work, for something on a weekend. Volunteer contributions are always considered in kind, and we'll talk a little bit more about the differences in these things as we work through today. So revenue that's generated by the project or the program is cash. So when you're putting a total project budget together, there's no distinction between cash and in kind. Both are funds spent on the project. So we're treating those in-kind contributions as though they are cash. And we have evidence of that. So when a grantor requires matching funds, you are actually allowed to have those funds be cash, in kind, or a combination of both. The only time you're not allowed to do that is if your grant requires matching funds that are cash, and it will actually specifically say that it has to be a cash match. So otherwise, you're able to match those funds in a combination of things, unless I said, again, it says cash match, and then you have to match it with cash, obviously, okay? So let's talk a little bit about that in-kind contribution. What does that look like? What does it mean? So here's just a definition that I will read off the slide for us. An in-kind contribution to the budget of a project is the fair market value of contributed real property, time, equipment, materials, supplies, facilities, services, travel, and the waiver of all or part of otherwise approvable indirect costs, which means it can basically be anything. Okay, right? Notice that there's a lot of things that are listed from here. So when we're talking about the things, this could be any and everything you could possibly think of that could be considered an in-kind contribution. The things that can be contributed to your program include people's time. So perhaps the service that they perform for your project. It can be, like I said, real property or equipment, materials. So almost everything falls into one of these categories. One thing that can never be considered an in-kind contribution is cash. Okay, so cash is cash, regardless of the source. Even if somebody is donating that, that is not an in-kind contribution. That has to be separate. Okay. And the other thing about this is one note about real property. That's a legal term that has a very precise meaning. So if you're talking about land, including buildings or improvements or natural assets like soil and trees and minerals and water, so those kind of things, that's actually real property. When you get into like equipment and materials, there's a little bit of a differentiation for that. Equipment actually are things, perhaps like a new printer, a new copy machine, something that costs like $5,000. So if you're putting in like for a new chair, that would fall into like materials rather than equipment, okay? And material and supplies are often used interchangeably. So you don't necessarily, if you're doing your narrative, have to differentiate. You can put materials / supplies. They do break it up here on this definition, but the reality is most of the time those two are used interchangeably. You do have to worry about equipment, okay? So if you are asking for something that's like in the $5,000 mark, and you can look, because most of the time in that grant dictionary, it will tell you exactly what's considered equipment and what's considered material and supplies, okay? So that's just a couple little definitions there between that real property, equipment, material, and supplies. Okay, so people's contributed time comes in many shapes and forms. So a few examples of that are maybe employee release time, or if you have foregone stipends or honoraria or allowances. or if you have volunteer work. So the rest of the items are basically a waiver, right? So anything that you can have between these two things. So if we talk a little bit about contributions, the condition that makes the provision of stuff into a contribution is that the provider of the stuff is not given payment, right? They're not remunerated is the big word for that. So the recipient of the contribution, which is you and your program, you don't pay that provider for the contribution that they're giving. That contribution is given freely. Contributions and therefore in kind can come from people or organizations that participate in the project. And while you're saying, well, okay, well, my program doesn't actually use any volunteers, we don't have any outside, but are you doing that? Are you putting your time in as a project manager? Are you overseeing multiple programs at this time where you're actually contributing? You're not necessarily on the quote unquote payroll for that. So are you giving that? And so in that case, your in-kind contribution, the hours that you're spending on that particular program, that is a donation, and that should be included in your total budget. Again, not in the grant request, but in that total budget, so we can see what the actual cost of the program is. And you may even have that with some of the employees that are within your program that are giving that time as an in-kind, okay? So think about who is performing what task and what are we paying them for? And are they giving some of their time for that or being paid for something else? And are we doing that properly? Okay, so even if we have like service providers or project participants, anybody who's involved with this project. And then the last piece of this that we want to talk about is this idea of fair market value. The value of this contribution then is the amount of money that it would cost if we had to purchase, lease, or rent the things to be contributed. So if we're looking at, and of course, most of us are not going to deal with real property, so I'm not going to focus very much on that. But if we were going to deal with something that was donated to us, let's say a building or an office space, even an outdoor yard type space, if somebody was going to come and spruce that up for us, we would actually consider that in-kind contribution based on the fair market value of the land or the building or that property. So there's a definition for that in that grant policy directive, so you actually could see what qualifies for that, okay? So what the definition actually is for fair market value is the price that a prudent person would pay for property, services, or other assets at a particular time under that free market condition. In other words, let's say you were going to get somebody to donate a bulldozer. Let's just use that, okay? Because you were going to tear down that to put in a garden, okay? And someone in town offered to let you do that. So what you would do is you would say, okay, well, what would the cost be for that if somebody was actually going to rent that machine? And then that would be the in-kind contribution that was made for that. So that's what it just means with fair market value. So if equipment and facilities are contributed, the same kind of thing, it's computed on how much it would cost for that. You just need to look up the source of that in your location for that same time frame to see what that would kind of mean. So when services are contributed, the value is the market value of the services performed, okay? So let's just do a little poll question here to see what we think about as far as in-kind contributions. So if you help out at the local food bank on the weekend, is that an in-kind contribution? Okay, can we want to see the results of what we found out here? Okay, so looks like the majority of you said yes, and that's the correct answer. I was a little tricky with you here because I used the words help out instead of volunteer, right? And a minute ago, I was just telling you that if you're volunteering, if you've got volunteer hours, that is actually an in-kind contribution. So if you are helping, if you are volunteering at a local food bank, that is an in-kind contribution to that local food bank. So the food bank itself should then be counting that as an in-kind contribution to their program, okay? So, okay, there's that. All right, so let's talk a little bit then about cost. There we go. So cost seems like a pretty straightforward idea, right? We all know what costs are. We deal with them in our everyday jobs. We deal with them in our homes and our families. You know, all of us have a budget. We are not the United States government. We don't get to just work willy-nilly and spend everything that we don't have, right? We all understand the idea of a budget and about the cost. But when you're dealing with budgets, especially when those are grant budgets, costs become a bit more complex. The first thing we have to do is decide whether or not a cost is allowable. And another word that is used oftentimes instead of allowable is allocable. So then we must classify it either as a direct or indirect cost. Okay, so we want to talk about allowable versus unallowable. So if it is allocable, then we must classify it either as a direct or an indirect cost. So how do we decide if a cost is allowable? Well, we have to follow the cost principles. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what those cost principles might look like. So here's what they do. Cost principles actually establish general standards for the allowability of costs. Okay, so this is just our general standards. So if we're looking at the cost principles, this is going to tell us what's allowed. Okay, cost principles also provide detailed guidance on the cost accounting treatment of costs as either direct costs or indirect costs. Okay, and they set forth allowability principles for selected items of cost. Okay, so what are the principles that we can do this? And then the applicability of a particular set of cost principles depends on the type of organization making the expenditure. So a nonprofit organization receiving a subaward from a state recipient would be subject to the cost principles for nonprofits, while the state is subject to cost principles for the state, the local, and tribal governments, and perhaps even the federal cost principles. So this can get very complicated very quickly, because when you're looking to see what's allowed and what's not allowed, you have to think about this. Is my grant coming from the federal level? Is it coming from the federal level through the state to me? Is it just coming from the state? And so you perhaps will have to take into account cost principles at multiple levels. So that's one thing to be really careful about, is to see if you get to just bypass that, or like I said, is it just coming from your state and are you following those cost principles? Or do you need to look at this like in terms of multiple tiered levels? Okay, so where do we find these cost principles? Well, they're set forth in a bunch of different documents, and they're included in the grants policy statement guide from the HHS in that folder, that material, that link that we have there with the dictionaries. So you have access to going to look specifically for that at the federal level. And then again, if you want to look, you can look, they actually offer them also at the state level. Okay, so let's think about these cost principles just in general. Like, what are they really giving us besides these four generic things? Okay, so the cost principles address 4 different tests that help you determine the allowability of cost. So here's the test, okay, to know whether something would be allowable. Reasonableness, that's the first test. And this includes necessity. So a cost is considered reasonable if in its nature or amount, it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made. So in other words, are you asking for something that's reasonable for what you're doing with it, right? Obviously, if we're asking for, you know, a new toilet and toilets cost $50, then we don't want to ask for $100 for that toilet. That would not be reasonable for that cost. We all have seen those pieces where military contractors or defense contractors, you know, are paying for what we consider a golden toilet at $250 a pop when they actually only cost $50. So we need to be really careful that when we're asking for specific amounts and we're outlining in our budget narrative where we're going to spend this grant money, that we need to think, are we being reasonable? Okay, so that's the first idea of cost principles just in general. So the cost principles elaborate on this concept and address considerations such as whether the cost is a type generally necessary for the organization or your program's operations or the grant's performance, whether or not the recipient complied with its established policies in incurring the cost or the charge, and whether the individuals responsible for the expenditure acted with due prudence in carrying out those responsibilities to the federal government and the public at large. as well as your organization. So that's this reasonableness test. And then the next test is this allocability, okay? A cost is allocable to a specific grant, function, department, or other component known as a cost objective if the goods and services involved are chargeable or assignable to that cost objective in accordance to the relative benefits received with this. So a cost then is allocable to a grant if it is incurred solely in order to advance the work under the grant. Okay. It has to benefit both the grant and other work of the organization, including other grant-supported projects or programs, or it's necessary for the overall operation that it can be assigned to that, particularly in terms of this grant. Okay. And the next thing we want to talk about here is consistency. Recipients must be consistent in assigning costs to these cost objectives. They must be treated consistently for all the work under similar circumstances. So again, if we're saying a toilet is $50 and we're using it in this part of the program, we actually have to go ahead and keep the $50 for everything else we're doing, okay? We want that to be consistent across time. So if you're saying X amount of something is spent, you want that to be throughout the whole program and across your organization. You don't want to be saying, oh, well, this is actually cheaper or more expensive for us, unless you can prove under some sort of reasonableness that your cost would be different in that regard, okay? And then the last piece of the overall arching cost principles is what we call conformance. This test of allowability, conformance with limitations and exclusions are including those in the cost principles. So this is going to vary with the type of activity, the type of recipient, and the kind of award you're getting. Allowable costs and activities provides information common to most HHS grants. And the reason I keep going back to that federal statute for that is that even at the state level, most times they're following these HHS principles so that there is some sort of consistency across grants and grant funding. So it specifies distinctions if there's a different treatment based on the type of the grant or who's getting it. So these 4 tests apply regardless of the particular category of cost, is one specified in the principles or if you're governed by other terms and conditions of an award. These tests also apply whether or not it's a direct cost or an indirect cost. And so this doesn't determine whether or not it's indirect or direct or in kind, but these principles are what you can say is this an allowable cost for me to include in my grant, okay? Because you don't want to fill out your whole budget narrative and you've included something that's not allowable and now your grant gets rejected. So you really want to be careful that when you're putting in the things for your grant, that you're making sure ahead of time that those are actually going to be something that's allowable, okay? All right, so again, I think this, there we go, the grants policy statement. So here you go. Again, I won't click on this today, but you'll have access to this inside the PowerPoint to get to it later. These are found in here. This is some of the things I've been referencing. It's very long. It's a lot of pages, but I will say just as a side note, if you want to make a mark for later, that on pages, it's section 2, pages 30 through 43, gives you a whole long list of things that would be allowed and not allowed, okay? So those are just, and they're just some of them, but they're ones that people consistently have questions about. So it's a very, very good resource. And again, that's section 2, pages 30 through 43. And then it also tells you whether they're allowable and unallowable, but also it tells you whether or not that can be considered a direct or an indirect cost, which of course is where we're going next. So that's a very, very good reference to not only say, okay, am I allowed to ask for this? And then am I supposed to consider this a direct or an indirect cost? So for some of us, this is going to be new, not only with the allowable versus unallowable, but then what are we considering as direct and indirect? And sometimes there's a difference on what we're considering direct and indirect. And so this will really very, very useful tool. Okay, so be sure you keep hold of this. All right, so now let's talk about direct versus indirect costs. Direct costs are the ones that can be identified specifically within a particular award, a project or a program, service or other organizational activity, and that can be directly assigned to such an activity with a high degree of accuracy. So what are we talking about with direct costs? They oftentimes include, but obviously are not limited to, things like salaries, travel, equipment, supplies, materials that directly benefit the grant supported project or program. Okay, so anything that you can be like, here's what we spent X dollars on, boom, that's a direct cost. And most of us are pretty familiar with the idea of direct costs. We know this, right? So if we think about it in terms of our own personal budget, right? If we can say, okay, here's the electricity, here's this, here's that. But this is where it gets a little tricky, because at home, we're going to consider all of those things direct costs, because here's what our budget is for the month. And we're going to say, this is rent or mortgage, this is groceries, this is utilities, this is, you know, if we're lucky enough to maybe have a housekeeper, right? If we can have that cleaning. If not, we should probably be putting that in as an in-kind contribution to the household, because if you're cleaning your own house, you are doing that as an in-kind contribution to the household, right? So those are the kind of things that we look at in terms of our own budgets. But when we start to talk about the program itself, then we get into this idea of indirect costs, okay? So this is perhaps facilities and administrative costs. These are costs incurred for the common or joint objectives that cannot be identified specifically within your project or program because you're within the confines of, let's say, your local health department, right? So while at home, we can say, here's how much our mortgage costs, or here's how much the electricity costs, or our telephone bill back in the day when we had our landlines at home, right? If we have those kind of things, we would still consider those just direct costs because they come out and we're all paying them as part of the household. But when we get into that office type setting and we've got multiple programs working under one roof, then we have to start to think of those in terms of indirect costs, because our program is not going to pay for all of the costs that are within the building, right? And so that's what we have to start to make sure. And this is really tricky because, again, most of us don't think in terms of direct and indirect costs. And for some of you, you may be getting charged for indirect costs and you don't even know where that's really coming from. So hopefully this will be a good time for you to start to kind of think about, like, what is this and how is it decided? And are you really keeping track with that? And how do we come back to making sure that we're on track, that those indirect costs are hitting the way that they should be? Okay, so facilities operation and maintenance costs, depreciation, and administrative expenses can be examples of costs that are usually treated as indirect. The organization is responsible for presenting costs consistently and must not include costs associated with indirect as direct. Okay, so we really have to be careful that we're doing that. So the question is, when is that an indirect cost? Okay, now you also have a handout in your folder that actually talks to you about direct versus indirect costs, so you can look at that later and maybe go back over and remember, you know, are we doing this correctly? So here's a couple things we want to think about. The purpose of the activity is spread over several projects, division, or activities. So if it does that, that could be an indirect cost, okay? If it's difficult or impossible to identify or compute the cost of that activity for each individual project, division, program, activity, right? And the last thing is, if the activity and therefore the associated costs are necessary to the operation of the organization, like perhaps the internet, right? Let's say we can't get work done without the internet. So that would fall into activity number 3, but also that we would not be able to necessarily be able to tell exactly what that cost is without sort of breaking that up. We're not paying a direct cost for that because it's part of what's going on in the office. So if we think, okay, we have these indirect costs, the next thing we have to ask ourselves are, is that allowable to have in our grant? Can we have indirect costs? Because obviously what we're thinking about in terms of typically of our budget, we're thinking in terms of the grant, and I said we have to be very specific about what we're spending our money on. Well, those are the direct costs. Those are the things that you can actually specify very simply. So then the question becomes, can you actually include indirect costs into your grant request? And the simple answer is, that depends, okay? So some grants don't allow any indirect costs. For example, what used to be considered the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they don't allow any indirect costs for any grants that they give. So it's very grant specific. So you need to actually be able to look at your grant. So typically, if you're getting something from the state or the federal, there is a way for you to have some indirect costs. But if you're getting a grant that comes from outside what we call the norm of, you know, funding through states or federals or local governments, you really have to be careful to see whether or not they will allow indirect costs. Because again, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives lots and lots of grants across the world, but you cannot include indirect costs in that particular grant. So currently, if we're talking at the state level, DPHHS, all grants, and actually this is at the federal level, all grants allow indirect costs, okay? But some grants consider the indirect costs as administrative and others do not. So remember a few minutes ago, I talked to you about indirect costs could include administrative. And so sometimes you're allowed to do it that way and sometimes you can't. So you have to be very careful that you look to see if your grant allows administrative costs in that indirect cost or not, okay? It's more typical that indirect costs are, let me click the button. Oh, skipped it. Okay, sorry. It's more typical really that indirect costs are not administrative costs. That's typically separate. The majority of the grant awards at DPHHS have language that states that indirect costs are approved under what we call a cost allocation plan, and they're separate from other grant administrative costs, okay? Okay, so then if that's the case, then how do we compute these? So indirect costs are often computed using a percentage called an indirect cost rate. So that can be one way that indirect costs are computed. So perhaps you have to turn in this indirect cost rate. It's computed by the financial people in the organization, hopefully using generally accepted accounting practices. So in the case of DPHHS, they use a federally approved, what they call cost allocation plan, because they're a public assistance agency. So there's a letter that's submitted with each grant application stating the use of the cost allocation plan when the grant requests an indirect rate, okay? So if the grant is asking you for an indirect cost rate to go with it, then you're going to in turn give them the cost allocation plan. And you're thinking, okay, but I don't know how that works. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the process of this. So what's the process? So every year, whether or not this is a brand new grant or the next year of the current grant that you're under, the program itself is going to do a cost allocation estimate request. And this is if you're working, like, let's say with the state health department, okay? So even if you've got a federal grant coming, if you're working at the state health department, and again, this may be true in your local health department as well, you may have your financial people who are going to give a cost allocation estimate. And at the state level, you're actually going to get a request form for them, and you're going to fill it out. So there's financial specialists within each bureau at the state level. So the program manager, which potentially is you, or the person who's writing the grant, which may not be you, would work with those financial specialists to complete the request. And then the specialists are going to send it on to the Financial Services and Operations Bureau. Again, this is at the state level. So I'm just using this as an example for some of you who are working with the state. So they're going to do a formal request to the cost allocation program. And then based on the information that you give, then that cost allocation program is going to do a calculation on their end, and then they're going to give back the estimated amount of what your indirects are going to be, okay? Now here's the kicker. This is just an estimate. It's strictly an estimate. So the grant could be charged more or less, okay? This is going to be our little snippet of why it's super important for you to document and knowing the importance of keeping track. This is really, really important when it comes to your indirects. You need to document well the activities of your grant so your estimate can be as close as possible, because the financial people need to be keeping an eye on the indirects hitting each month and relay that information to the program manager. So you should be meeting with your program manager monthly, okay? I mean, as a program manager, you should be meeting with your financial specialist. So if you're at the state health department, there's a financial specialist in your bureau. And if you're not meeting with them on a monthly basis, then you need to call them up and say, hey, I need to start meeting with you once a month. And again, if you're at the local level, you need to check to see like who is in charge of coming up with your cost allocation plan for your indirect costs, and you need to be meeting with that person as well, because you don't want to wait until the end of the year, okay? Because the relationship between your financial specialist and the program manager is very, very important. You really want this good communication between one another. And if you're documenting your stuff very, very well, then it's much easier for the financial specialist to come up with a cost allocation for you that is going to be more on track. And then you're not going to have to worry so much that your indirects are going to come out to bite you later, okay? Because that's the last thing we want. So you want to make sure you guys are on the same page as far as your grant budget is concerned. And then indirects are legally required to be paid first before the direct cost to the grant. The only time that the cost allocation people won't charge more than the estimate is if your grant specifically put the cap on the indirect amount. So let's say the indirect amount is set at $500, then even if your indirect costs go over that, you won't be charged more than that, at least for that grant. Now, again, that's back to your total project budget where you might actually have to come up with the funds to cover the more than your indirect if that's the cap on this. There's a few grants at the state level that they deal with that work like this, but not very many, okay? All right, so direct costs, here's the 9. These are pretty easy and pretty self-explanatory. So we can just say, again, oops, sorry. These are pretty simple if we're looking. These are the things that you would include under your direct costs: personnel and fringe, travel, stipends, honorarium, services and consultants, property, equipment, materials, facility, supplies, okay? Again, for most of us, most of these things work out well, and maybe even the personnel cost, right? And you do have this in a handout, the direct costs, remember, versus the indirect. So in absolute terms, we could use fewer categories. We could put some of these things together, but back to that documentation piece, if we have them separate, sometimes if we lump things together, then it's really hard to tell. And perhaps we spent something one year that we wouldn't spend the next year. Let's say we have a big gala and we're going to give an honorarium to our big guest speaker, but we don't have a gala except for every 5 years. If we stick the stipends in with the honorarium, one year it's going to look like it was really, really high, and we won't be able to tell how come, okay? So the more categories we can break this down into, the better it is for us to be able to see exactly what we're spending and where we're spending it, okay? And you may have other things that you put on here as far as your direct costs that are not even on this category, okay? Now, the one other thing to think about is this. In many budget forms, you're going to see a line item called miscellaneous, okay? Miscellaneous, let's pretend that does not exist, okay? Because you want to put a 0 in there. Because what exactly is the money you put into miscellaneous really for? Okay, there's the question you want to ask yourself. Now, here's the deal. Many, many moons ago, maybe 3 or 4, okay, I actually was the treasurer for my son's boys basketball boosters, okay? And as the treasurer, I was given an allowance of up to $500 to put in for miscellaneous, okay? But you don't want to do that because, again, if you start using things under miscellaneous, realistically, those should either be a direct or an indirect cost or an in-kind contribution, okay? The problem is if you start putting things in under a miscellaneous category, then the grantor is going to say either you didn't know what you were doing on your budget or that you think this miscellaneous is your little contingency slush fund. So that just sort of signifies that we're not really sure about our budget, or that we maybe don't have faith that we can find and compute all the costs that are involved in our project or program. So we want to be really careful. Now, again, if you want to put in miscellaneous, you know, for $100 that perhaps you're going to use as petty cash, right? But then you really could just put a petty cash line in on your direct cost and say that's what you're using for petty cash fund. So even then, you really don't want to have this miscellaneous fund because, again, it comes out looking sort of like a slush fund, and that's not very good, okay? Now, of all these direct costs, we can easily, like I said, most of you understand what all these. The one thing I really want to talk about is personnel and fringe, okay? So this is the cost. Obviously, personnel is paid for your paid personnel. They can be full or part-time. They might be salary or hourly. That's hard to say together. So the key is that you want to put the person's wages into this category if your organization is responsible for withholding taxes. Okay, so if you withhold taxes, that person is an employee. And the reason this matters is because sometimes we see that we're like contracting out for a particular service. And if we're not withholding tax, then those people are not actually considered employees. We have to put that in something different as like a service provider, like a contract. Okay, so wages paid to employees would go into this category. The real part that I want to talk about in this section is the fringe. Fringe refers to the amount of cash it costs your organization for an employee over and above your employee wages. Fringe is made up of several items, all paid by the employer. Okay, these items include things like matching Social Security tax, matching Medicare tax. And if we put these two together, that's what people refer to as FECA. And then we want to also think about the state unemployment insurance, the federal unemployment insurance, which is FUTA, workers' comp insurance, and any other benefits provided by your organization like healthcare, life insurance, dental, and retirement. your organization may pay all or some of the fringe items that included. So fringe is calculated as a percent of the wages. So of course your payroll people know what your fringe rate is, and it can run from as low as 10 to as high as 50% or up to 52%. I actually just saw something recently where the fringe was worth 52%. So when you're thinking about how much you're going to pay someone, if you have put in the grant and you're going to pay them X amount of dollars, like let's say you request $20,000 in the budget for the director, but your fringe rate is 32%. You're going to be forced to pay that. And so it's going to come out of what you can actually pay them as far as wages. And so if you promised them that $20,000, it actually would not be that, because that's made up with, that can only include what your fringe is. So many, if not most, grantors require that you use grant paid staff to supplement existing staff, okay? So you want to make sure you're not transferring these funds. You got to be really careful that you're including the fringe. And that's really one of the things that people don't think about when they say, oh, we have this grant, this includes this personnel, it's for $20,000, boom. Okay, but if this is a full-time employee and your fringe rate is 20%, you need to make sure that you're not offering that person the $20,000. Yes, they're still getting that in their fringe benefits, but you have to calculate those separately, okay? So we don't want to do that. We got to make really sure that we are covering that as far as that goes, okay? So let's see. Let's talk about, I think we have 2 more poll questions, actually. Let's do one at a time. The question is, which of the following influence indirect costs? We want to mark all that apply. Okay, so we want to show the answers to this.
It shows that it's sharing. What are you guys seeing?
Okay, yeah, it does now. Sorry. I can
That's
never
okay.
tell if it's just the poll itself or it's a thing. Now I see that.
I know.
Stop sharing at the bottom. Okay, so it says, which of the following are influence indirect costs? And the answer is actually all the above. Okay, this one again is kind of tricky because we see staff on there and we're thinking, well, isn't that payroll? Perhaps, but again, if there's a person who is working in multiple places that's within that organization, maybe you don't have that person like actually in your payroll particularly. So just another thing to think about. Like if your payroll, like you're probably not doing payroll, like we get that one, right? We see that one in number of contracts is easier, but purchases for budgeting. So if there's things that you have to do that are without that, so perhaps, and that might mean like that you're the financial specialist, okay? So back to that state example, if you have a financial specialist, that person is being paid basically as an indirect cost from all of you to cover that particular salary, okay? So that's what we want to think about. Okay, so we can stop this one, and then let's just ask one more. So out of the direct costs we discussed, which one is most often forgotten by the manager? Okay. Let's see what we got. Okay, good. The majority of you picked Friends, and that's the one, right? Because it's easy to put some of these things down, but if we forget that Friends rate of what are we paying in all their extra taxes and in their life insurance and health insurance, especially if we've got full-time employees, but even your part-timers, like that can be the one that gets you because you're saying, well, we don't offer them benefits. But if you're still paying some taxes on that, that's still going to be Friends. So you have to figure out what the Friends rate is for those. Okay, so Friends, that's the one that's most often forgotten. We want to be really careful. Okay, so let's go on here. And you're going to notice that I've said a lot of times documentation, documentation, documentation. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some financial management maxims in just a second. But I would just want to, again, note the importance of documentation. And we're going to come back to this at the end, and I'm going to give you like 5 really good specific reasons of why we care about documentation. But you should also have already noticed that accountability is really, really high when it comes to these grants. And you don't want to do anything that jeopardizes getting the grant again in the future. So grant proposals from HHS are very stringent, and so are the accountability expectations for your grant and you as the manager once the money has been distributed. So you must adhere to the grant budget for the duration of the grant period, okay? So you have to, whatever it says you're doing, so you have to do it that way. Now, if for any reason you have to make changes to your work plan or your budget, you have to get approval before deviating from what was approved. This is true for a grant budget or for your work plan from DPHHS. If you're making changes, you have to document the changes and why you have to make the change. And then you have to have approval prior to implementing. Only if the requested changes are approved can you deviate from the original work plan. So again, you can't be shifting funds from here to here over the course of the grant or the year or whatever that is that you're working with. You have to get approval to do so, or you risk not getting the grant in the next time. So super, super important that you're documenting, because again, you may be given the opportunity to make that change, but if you don't have the documentation to back it up, you're not going to get the approval for that. Okay, so here's just a few financial management maxims. Again, we want to comply with our organization's financial policies and procedures. Spend the money the way you said you would in your proposal. Document every financial transaction, no matter how small, even if it's that miscellaneous or petty cash. Obviously, we want to use professionals, which means talking to our financial specialists when we can. Comply with the reporting requirements for everybody. And then we also want to be thorough and on time and prudent and honest. Okay. When in doubt, you can contact the grantor itself. Okay. Don't just assume, oh, this looks like it's right. Find somebody who knows the answer to the question so that you don't make a mistake that's going to cost you the grant later. Okay. When in doubt, always ask. All right, let's talk a little bit about variance analysis. Okay. Variance analysis actually focuses on the differences between realized values and forecasts, and it's an important technique for controlling financial performance. In accounting, a variance is the difference between an actual value and the budgeted value, often called a standard. In effect, variance analysis is an examination and interpretation of the differences between what has actually happened and what was planned for. Now, in an ideal world, this would be exactly the same every time, right? Our actual budget and our budgeted budget would be the exact same, okay? So we want to make sure that we're staying as close to that as possible, because we don't want to be in trouble when it comes to the end of the year, okay, or with the end of the grant. So variance analysis doesn't help fix everything, but we're going to see here, I'm going to show you an example of one of these things. It helps managers ask the right questions, and sometimes that's really all we can ask for, right? So it's really essential to the managerial control process. Actions taken in response to variance analysis can dramatically improve your operations and financial performance of your program. So many variances are actually controllable, meaning they can be corrected by you. So you can take actions to avoid unfavorable variances in the future. So here's the one thing I'm going to say about variance analysis. We don't want to ever use this as a blaming tool. If we're finding that we're not staying where we should be, if there's an issue, we don't want to come out with guns blazing over that, right? We want to make corrections to it. This is a tool, okay? The goal of the variance analysis is to uncover the cause of some operational problems so that the problems can be corrected as quickly as possible or avoided or minimized in the future. So clearly you're going to say, well, I can't control all the variances. Certain things happen, AKA a global pandemic, that we don't have control over. Totally true. Okay. But the goal of the variance analysis is to look to see if there's issues, things that we can control, and if we need to revise our plan to cover like the rest of this particular grant funding or this year, to tighten those controllable costs to offset any unfavorable things that are happening in that area that's beyond our control. Okay. So I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to look at this technique. So this is in your handout folder. There's actually this tutorial. This is a really great resource to come back to, and there's like 3 different pieces of it, and a lot of the information I'm giving you today comes from this. Louis Gopinski was actually very much into financial accounting person. He's got several textbooks out that cover for public health, so he's actually was a very good resource. He has since passed away, but they still keep printing his books, so obviously he knows a thing or two about what he's talking about. Okay, so notice this one. This is the beginning budget. This is the dental clinic's first quarter budget that's on the slide. So we're going to pretend like the quarter's over and the finance office has provided the manager with actual expenses that occurred during that period. So if we're going to conduct a variance analysis, now you as the manager have to compare what has happened in that first quarter with what was expected to happen. Then you have to determine problem areas and take some action. So we want to make sure those actual expenses are in line with what we projected. So notice this example is just divided into quarters. And what did I tell you earlier today? Perhaps that's not the way you want to do it, but this example is just showing it to be simplistic. So we're looking at the first quarter versus the annual budget. We're going to make a comparison. Are we staying in line? So this particular budget would be just broken into 4, okay? And as I mentioned, maybe you're doing things like immunization clinics and whatnot that are spending more of your budget. Maybe you've got a spring fling that you're using every year that spends more money or makes more money, okay? So this one is just in that basic one. So here's what we're looking at. Here's just all the things. This is what we actually spent. And here's the budget for the year. Okay, so we want to look at the next one then. And here this breaks it down a little bit. Okay, so in general, a variance is obtained when you subtract one budget from the other. So the subtraction can actually be done either way. You can take this initial budget minus the actual and get a variance, or you can take the actual minus the budget and get a variance. It's going to give you the same number. It's just going to be whether or not you like to see it in terms of a negative or a positive. And some of us, our brains think better when we see it as a negative, and sometimes our brains think better if we see it as a positive. Okay. So in this formula that they use here is actual results minus the initial budget. Again, you can do it the other way around. So they took the initial, they're using the initial minus the actual. So it's actually set up this one minus this one. And there you go. And you can see this in the director compensation, right? 13,000. This is the actual. And so they're actually up $479. Now, some of you may be going, great, that's awesome. But really, you don't want that to be the case. We don't want there to be variance in any of these categories over or under. We want to stay with it as best we can. But once we have actually done this variance analysis, we can see quickly, if we put into percentages over here, where there's a problem. So we're up here, but what we really want to start looking at is where are those parentheses? That's our negatives. That means that we're in the hole, right? Because this is our initial and this is how much we actually spent. And so if we look really quickly, you can see that this 22.3%, that's bad, right? Ooh, so this is the one that we want to really go look at. And this is the beauty of the variance analysis, right? We can see this and then we can go dig deeper. So now we know that we want to actually look at the hygienist compensation. This is causing us quite a bit of problems, okay? So if we click the next one, once we start to look at what we're paying for these hygienists, here's what we initially put in. We said we were going to do 576 hours. Well, our results, we actually only had them for less hours. So that's not the problem. We didn't have them in there for too many hours. But if we look at the pay, look at the difference in pay here. We thought we were going to pay them $12.22 an hour, but we ended up having to spend $15 and almost 81 cents. So there's that difference in the compensation and that variance at the 22.3%. Okay. So we want to think about that. And perhaps this isn't your fault. Perhaps this is, let's say you have a grant for 5 years and the going rate now is $15 instead of that 12 that you had originally gotten that grant for. Okay. So you're paying attention here to say, okay, but now, even though this is not your fault, right? Again, we don't want to place blame at the variance analysis, but we want to see, okay, what can we be doing for that? So perhaps what we would want to do is that we're either going to have to see if we can get people to maybe volunteer their time, or we're going to have to not have as many people. That hours is actually going to have to be reduced. And we're going to need to get permission to be paying this $15 an hour, right? So that's back to, we can't just start doing this And because look how much it's changing our budget. Okay. So that's one of the things that we really want to think about when it does this kind of dental clinic. So we have several options where we as managers could make a change. Okay. So in your handouts folder, there is one called variance analysis. And again, I'm leaving you this to practice on your own. So you can just take that simple formula of doing one to the other and then getting that percentage analysis of what you're doing. And I will bring it up so you can see what it looks like real quick, but we won't do it here. Oops, that's the budget one. Here's our variance. So here's the actual budget. Here's what we actually spent. Here's our budget. And this is how we can do it. So this one minus this one, right? We just hit equals actual minus the budgeted amount, right? And then we can just drag that down. Of course, it's going to give us a few little zeros along the way, but that's okay. And then you can figure out the percentage of that. And to do that, we just want to say equals our variance. Actually, we want to put this in parentheses. Our variance divided by what we actually budgeted, okay, the budget itself. So what percentage of that budget, and then we can put the parenthesis, and then we want to multiply that by 100, and that's going to give us our percentage, okay? So if you wanted to use this, like I said, as a practice, and then be able to do it on your own budget, this way, if you make a mistake here, you can do it. So very quickly, then I'll just show you. If we're looking at this, anything that's a negative is bad, right? Because, or I'm sorry, I did it the other way around. So the actual is what we spent. So where we're over, any of the positives in this case are bad. So we're looking here like payroll taxes, right? We're looking at those kind of things to where we have actually spent more than we should have. So that can help you identify, and then you can kind of go back in and look at this case, okay? And notice in this one, we're not actually in charge with it. We're not in trouble with the fringe. So that's good, okay? Did we go back to my actual slideshow? Did it jump? Okay, cool. Okay, so that's our variance analysis. And then let's talk a little bit about budget cuts, which no one likes to do, okay? But just a few things to think about, because all of your budgets are different. And so I can't just give you the do this, this, and this when it comes to budget cuts. But one thing we can talk about is that sometimes we get really, it's very frustrating and nerve-wracking to think about making budget cuts. And what we can see is that perhaps we're looking at it in a way, it's always going to be painful, okay, right? Nobody wants to make budget cuts. Nobody wants to have to cut services or staff or provide, not provide the things that we want to do. But again, a few of the things that we can actually think about are, they don't necessarily have to be across the board. And this is where we get into some issues, because let's say your budget is cut by 10%. The first instinct is that we have to cut everything by 10%. And that's not really the case, okay? We don't necessarily have to cut across the board by 10%. We have to come up with a way that the program or the project budget decreases totally by 10%. And I'll give you a very quick example of this. So several years ago in 2015, California was under an immense years-long drought. And the governor at the time, Governor Brown, decided that the state of California was going to decrease water usage by 25%. Now, the first thought is that everybody everywhere was going to have to decrease their water usage by 25%. And actually, that's not what happened. So Governor Brown said the overall goal was that the water usage total had to come down by 25%. And then the State Water Resources Control Board was actually in charge of figuring out how to make that happen. So again, the first option would have just been for everyone to cut 25% of their water usage. But that didn't make a lot of sense, because certain, if we talk about agricultural, that could implode on food supplies, food products, things of that nature. And some people were already using not very much water a day, so it could potentially be a health hazard. So what they wanted to do was come up with some sort of tier system that would then apply to how much people would actually have to reduce, that would come up with a total of 25% reduction. So that's kind of what I want you to think about in terms of your own budget when you're faced with cuts. Is, do you really have to? Is it specified that you have to cut everything across the board, or is it just telling you to cut 10% total? And so what can you do to make that kind of happen, okay? And so again, the State Water Resources Control Board, what they did was they came up with a tier system. So people who were using, it was set on a system of 8%, 16%, 24, or 32%. So people who were using the most amount of water had to cut 32%. Now, in theory, this looks good. And I did some research on this so a few years back and found out that it wasn't actually very equitable the way that they did it, but they had a good thought in mind. Okay. And the thought was that people using the most should have to cut the most, right? But the problem was this: a lot of people were using, just a side note, most people use between 80 and 100 gallons of water a day. So some people were using like 900 gallons because we have people who have, multiple areas, like huge landscaping, right? Don't forget, we have all the Hollywood stars here, right? So they have these great big ranches and mansion type areas. And so they were supposed to have to reduce by 32%. But the craziness is that meant that they still had like 600 gallons a day. And we had some people in communities who the water bill was already high for them. And so they had reduced their usage to that like 80 gallons or less a day. And so even to reduce for them to 8% was going to put them under a safe and sanitary working condition. So the whole point of showing this as an example for this is like, you really need to look at your budget and think, okay, if I have to get 10% cut, do I need to cut across the board? Like, is that actually going to be the best for the organization, for the program? Or are there specific areas that we could cut that, yes, maybe still be painful, but that in the process of that, we could really look to see like maybe making things work more efficiently and effectively, and what is costing us the most amount of money to begin with, and is that a place where we might want to do that cut that really then wouldn't harm everybody overall? Again, still not happy of having to, you may potentially lose someone or cut programs or policies, but we want to talk about that. Okay, so again, I'm going to have you, sometimes if you have revenue, right, we can just do something that we can to increase the revenue, and that'll help us offset budgets. But for the most of us, a lot of us don't have revenue generating pieces. We're actually just working with that expense budget. So we don't have that option potentially. So if we can't increase our revenues, then what are the things we can do? So in your handout folder, there's something called an in-class exercise for budget cuts, which again, I'm going to let you look at. I'm going to bring it up and just talk us through it. There's a Word document that actually gives you something to play around with. So that might be fun for you to kind of see where you might cut. But let's just look at this a little bit. And this is what's really cool about this for us is we could actually talk about it this way. First of all, it's got revenue and expenses. So what kind of budget is that? It's an operating, right? Because it's got both. It's got both revenue and expense. So this is an operating budget. We're looking at the whole thing. Also, let's notice here, the indirect overhead and administration costs, they've got it right here, okay? So this is where they've got that indirect rate. And in this one, notice that they have administration included in that. And remember I told you earlier, you may or may not be able to include administrative costs within this. So in this particular one, they were allowed to do so. So indirect overhead and admin all were included in here, and that was 15%. So that's that cost allocation rate that I was talking about. So here's the percentage that you have to pay across the board for all these different services that you're providing. So this is a Happy Valley Kids service, right? It's just a made up little thing. So we have crisis service preventions, we have assessment intake, we have outpatient services, assertive community treatment, peer support, and special projects. So notice how we have all of these columns set, and what are we paying out? What are we bringing in from each of these? And what are we paying out? And again, I set them all up for you so that they're already summed as to why it's working. So you can actually get in here and just start playing around with changing numbers, and it will change everything for you. Okay, so it's set to use as like a little practice fun sheet, and then before you actually go messing with your real budget, right? To be able to make some of these changes. But again, notice that they have included here salary, benefits, and taxes. So they did not break the fringe down. They have included it, but they didn't put it as a separate line. I would suggest putting it separately so that you don't forget the fringe, and so that you can see exactly what you're spending in fringe. Because again, if your organization ups the fringe rate, that's going to change what you're spending as far as the overarching. And if you're giving somebody a raise, like you've got to think about that, like how much is that fringe going to go up? So how much are you really able to offer them as far as an hourly increase or a salary increase? So if you keep them separately, that's going to be more beneficial in the long run. Okay. All right. So one thing I just will note is this: if we're looking here at this net margin, what we've got left, quickly we can see that we are having issues under the peer support and special projects. So rather than saying we're going to cut everything across the board, especially because we have some of these things that are actually generating revenue and we're making money above what we're expending, right? So we don't necessarily want to cut some of those services because that's what's bringing in our money, right? So we can kind of maybe look over here at some of these variances that are coming in negative, and perhaps we can see, okay, why are we spending so much when this is all that we're making? So this might be a way in which you can attack that budget cut a little bit differently, because you can use that variance analysis tool to sort of see where are you leaking, and maybe that's where you can help to cut, and then maybe it wouldn't be so hard for the program as a whole. Now, obviously, we're still going to have some issues here, because anytime we have to make cuts, nobody's happy with that. I understand. Okay. So the Word document that I gave you actually then just allows you, it tells you like, okay, if you're going to cut this much, 5% from here and 7% from here, like what does that look like? And where would you need to make some additional cuts then in your expenses to hit a net margin of 500,000, because we know the cuts are coming. Okay. So if you have your budget set up in a way that you can do this, you can literally just start punching in numbers until you get to the number that you need to get to hit that 10%. Okay. So there's a couple, this handout is in there, and then there's one actually that helps you kind of do it. You could put your own budget in it, and it will actually make the changes for you based on the percentages that you put in. So hopefully that's a very useful tool as well. Okay, now we want to, for my third and final time today, let's talk about documentation. And here's why. So here's just the big five, okay? We want to manage that project effectively. We want to be efficient and effective. And if you document absolutely everything you can think of, it's easier to do that, because if we have a problem, you can go back and look at our documentation and figure out where the problem is. We really want to document, and I cannot stress this piece enough as a personal note, to evaluate the project results. So most of you are, at this point in time, a lot of us now have an evaluation component to our program. And I will tell you, as somebody who has completed an evaluation, one of the hardest parts for an evaluator is to come in and try to do an evaluation with not the right amount of data. You will want to have answers to your questions, and an evaluator cannot do that if you don't have the right things documented, because we don't have the right data. We don't have the right paperwork, and then we can't answer the questions that you are asking, and that's not good, right? And so you have to think about that. And this is my little side plug for, if you are thinking about when you are starting a new year, like if you were doing an evaluation, what would the questions be that you would need answered? And what do you have to document in order to hand that to somebody to answer you the questions? Okay, so that's super important. And again, none of us wants to reinvent the wheel. If we see something that's going on really well in the real world, we want to be able to give that information to them. Like, what if they see that our little program is working so great, they want to replicate that at the state level, or they want to replicate that in their state? And you can share that information if you have things documented, because otherwise they don't know how to follow what you've done because you haven't documented, okay? So you want to provide that guidance for replication, and you want to be able to give that as evidence so that you can continue to get that grant funding, right? You want to say, hey, we did this, this, and this, and here's all of our documentation to show that's true. So we really want to make sure of that. And don't forget, again, documentation is super important for getting that cost allocation rate at the beginning of every year, so that you're hitting those indirect costs where you should be. Okay. And then the last thing that we want to talk about today is the budget narrative itself. Okay. So I know that some of you are working where you have actually applied for the grant yourself, so you've already done a budget narrative. Some of you are working in programs where the grant was already there, so you may not even know what the budget narrative was. You just think, here's X amount of dollars that I get for the grant. So this is a good opportunity for you to go and check to see what the budget narrative actually was, to make sure you're following what you're supposed to. And then finally, you might be in a position where you're, again, getting ready to reapply for a grant. And so you need to put together a budget narrative, okay? So budget narratives are very important when you're applying or reapplying for your grant. The more detailed and in-depth, the greater the likelihood of funding. You want to be super specific here. And then here's an example. So I am just going to click off of this. And go here. And I put, let's see. There we go. Can you see that? Did it stay? Okay, I think so. So I put like 3 different ones in your handouts folder, because depending on the kind of grant you're applying for, they look a little bit different. So I wanted you to see multiple options. I just pulled up this one because they use it all the time as an example. And this one's pretty simple. you'll see sometimes that the budget narrative that you have to give is actually relatively complicated. So I did give you a couple of others that are more complicated so that you can look at them and have an example. And of course, you can always just Google a budget narrative and bring it up. But notice here, this is the example. Dr. Pai will serve as principal investigator, will commit 2 summer months of effort to this project and will be primarily responsible for a 3% salary increase and has been budgeted in other years as standard. So here's the other people. Here's what we're going to have. Here's the other personnel, what they're actually doing. Now, again, a lot of these you're going to see that they're actually in tables where it breaks it down. It looks like a little budget, and it's got all the listings of the salary, how many hours they're going to spend, how much time that is there an in-kind contribution for that? What is the total cost, and which part of that are you covering from the grant? Okay. And then again, any benefits that were here, this is the standard estimate. Students are at 1% full-time and 9% for part-time. The budget is the actual rate. Travel is considered in here. Here's this equipment. So all those things we talked about today, if we need a subcontractor, which most of you are not, but are there other awards that are being followed? So here's the checklist. Here's what you can review. Again, a lot of times you are limited to just 2 or 3 pages. So you've got to be really careful as to what they're asking. This one is very, very simple, very simple. And so let me just show you really quickly. I know we're almost out of time here. So that's that one. I'm trying to look to see. Maybe it wants to open. If not, it's in your folder. It's called the HIV prevention one. And it is much more detailed and much more lengthy. And of course, that's because that's what's required. And there we go. Okay. So see, notice how this one is 20 pages. Okay. That is much different than the one we just looked at. So you really want to think about, like, are you allowed to do this? See how that gives the total of what you're spending in salary and wages? But look, it's giving you literally this percentage of time that everyone is spending. And it gives a description. This is the important part, right? This is where you say, I'm going to spend this money for these people in this way. And you have to stick to it. So be very, very careful when you're creating that budget narrative that you know exactly what you want to spend this on. Because remember, if you're going to change this, you have to get approval to do it. So your budget narrative is literally like your contract. Okay. So I cannot stress the importance of this budget narrative enough, because this is like, I'm going to do this with this dollars in this time in this way. Okay. And you have to stick with it. So notice everything. And the more specific you can be here, the better off it is, because you want to get the money for this grant and you want them to say, okay, this doesn't work because you're not explaining it thoroughly enough. Okay. So same thing, job consultant. So this is for everyone that was just in that table. This is the actual description of what these people are doing. And then we get through here. Oh, there it is. There's our friend, and it's calculated, and it's the public health division current average friends rate is 56.4. There's one of those really high ones. So you're including that. Like, what is the rate for that? What would you have to pay for that? And you're explaining, you're justifying what that is for. Okay. Here's what we're needed as far as supplies go and how much that's going to cost. Okay. So this is, like I said, this is a very good example of a very specific, very detailed one. And then I have one other one in there that does kind of the same thing. So you do have a bunch of options for that. So notice here it's saying, what is my justification for this? Here's what we're having. Here's our cost. And they put the table first. So rule number 1 for anytime you do something, if you have a table, you should have a summary underneath it that explains to people what they're looking at in that table. Okay. So that's the big thing. So hopefully all of this information will be useful, and that you have, like I said, the handouts and some of those practice things to work on. And then hopefully you can use those things to go back and look at your own budget and your own narratives and think about what you're doing. If you're not checking in with your financial person, please be doing so you know your indirect costs, where they're coming from. Make sure you're not getting charged more than you should be. If you're only using, 1/5 of the office space, you should only be being charged for 1/5 of what's going on. So ask questions. That's how you get answers, and that we can make those changes. So with that, does anybody have any questions? Okay.
No questions. All right. Well, thank you. That was very, very helpful, Trisha. I mean, I could have used that in my program management days for sure. Thank you all for joining us. I did put the link to the evaluation in the chat, so please feel free to give us your feedback because we always like to share that with our trainers and provide the best training that we can for you, which I think this one really was. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll give you back the rest of your day. Thank you.